Well, hello, I'm Professor Mark Harmon, and I appreciate this opportunity to present research to the Research Symposium. I want to let you know what I'm up to, and I think you'll enjoy this little bit of work I've been doing related to labor issues and more specifically strike coverage. So let me share a screen here, and we will get to that directly. What you see is that the title of this work is U.S. Network TV Newscasts Are Still Labor to Understand Strikes. And why do this? Well, you think about it, strikes are a huge moment of conflict, right? They are a clash that reveals so much about our news instincts. And because news is a business as well as a journalistic enterprise, let's find out what goes on. And are there certain habits that are perhaps subtly biased against those who strike? We'll go to the slideshow here and go to the master. And what you see here, we go look at this. What this really is, the study is a follow-up. It's one that Shuyai Lee and I did in 2010 and published in Journalism Quarterly. U.S. network TV newscasts from late 1968, with the start of the Vanderbilt TV News Archive, until the end of 2008, covered domestic strikes and lockouts. That's what we looked at. And we found out that when we tried to create a measure, it was difficult, but we did. We created a measure. We looked at the number of work days idled, worker day idled by strikes. The Bureau of Labor Statistics has that. And then we wanted to see if maybe over that time period, if you equal things out by sort of the significance of it, worker day idled, was there a steady network decline in interest in strikes? We didn't find that. What we found instead was a notable trend that coverage was less about worker grievances and the clash with ownership, and more about the inconvenience strikes create for other businesses, consumers, and especially sports fans. We suspected there might be a class-based issue as strike coverage drifted away from lower class strikes like bus drivers and toward more strikes inconveniencing middle and upper classes, such as pilots for airlines. So with that said, why not follow up? Why not see if those trends are continuing? And this follow-up study takes a look at the same network TV newscast, ABC News, World News Tonight, CBS Evening News, NBC Nightly News, uses the same archive, the Vanderbilt TV News Archive and Index. And I used a keyword strike to search the period from January 1st, 2009 to May 22nd, 2021, picking up from the end of the last study and moving it forward. I also did the same procedure with the word lockout. And of course, extraneous hits such as lightning strike were removed. The resulting 70 items became a compilation of order, that we ordered from the archive and paid for, thank you very much, to a Dean's Summer Research Grant to help pay for those archival costs of making those videos available for inspection. The content analysis was each news story. I dealt with prima facie observations such as network, date, length, workers striking, entity strike, number of sound bites, persons appearing in sound bite. Now, the deeper analysis was of long form stories that included sound bites. Also kept a separate tally of shorter stories such as VO or reader stories, by definition without sound bites. I also looked at the Bureau of Labor Statistics annual data on major strikes to see which disputes were not being covered at all. Now, recent work, and there's a bunch of it, but you'll have to read the paper, and I encourage you to do so, justifies the following two hypotheses: that network TV newscasts will show a greater concern for the consumer consequences of strikes by having more sound bites from third parties affected than from striking workers. And second hypothesis, the U.S. network newscast will have high attention to sports and entertainment strikes compared to other large strikes, such as the BLS gives us its data on number of workers idled. So what happens when we look at these data? Well, hypothesis one, let me backtrack a bit here, was not supported overall. It had mixed results. Long form stories had 110 sound bites from workers out of 271. That's not quite half. There were 80 sound bites from people affected, so slightly more from workers than by those affected, but you have to also throw in an additional 54 from others, parents of students idled by strikes. And you get a sort of mix where there's no majority, but there is a plurality. And that plurality is of strike being maybe 45%, and things related to the strike making up the rest of it. The management position was 35 bytes, but an additional 6 times, they got a full screen graphic of their stated position. Analysts and experts made up the remaining 44 bytes. What about hypothesis 2, the idea that sort of high quality entertainment, sports, and otherwise disruptive strikes to people's lives and entertainment? Well, that was strongly supported. There were 15 long form and 12 short form stories about sport and entertainment strikes. Teacher strikes, often from the perspective of inconvenienced parents, made up 30 long form stories, 21 short form. Auto worker and dock worker had 7 and 6 respectively, plus some short stories. What was fascinating is what is not covered. Okay, for example, traditional blue collar things such as the Communication Workers of America strike against Verizon. 1.2 million idle workers, but only 1 story. And a 2011 CWA strike yielded 2 short stories. The Union of Needle Trades, Industrial and Textile Employees, 2018, had a strike against Chicago hotels and later Marriott Corporation, but no network TV news stories. Same is true of the United Food and Commercial Workers strike against Stop and Shop markets, and the AFSCME strike against the University of California Medical Centers, and no network TV news coverage of the consolidated Edison lockout of the utility workers union. So these traditional blue collar unions are not showing up, even though they're making what would normally be considered a newsworthy event. Now, most of the strikes were indeed strikes and not lockouts. But there were also 2 reports on slowdowns and 1 on a National Labor Relations Board dispute. Long form stories, mean length of just under 117 seconds, and a mean number of just under 4 sound bites within them. Short form stories averaged 19.4 seconds. And here's one of those sort of subtle things that I have to remark upon. 17 times the union position in a labor dispute was called a demand. 10 times the labor position was called an offer. And those terms never were flipped. So that may give a little bit of the sort of subtlety of the political communication, economy of communication model, the blind spots of structure and tradition that don't suggest active bias, but do suggest sort of the way things are done may influence these habits, might not always be reflective of good news values. Now, looking ahead, how do we get to CNN, Fox? Those things are difficult because when I looked at it, their strike stories were often lumped together in sort of big summaries of other stories. It may be difficult to ferret out their actual coverage. And of course, we're going to need a totally new method to deal with online coverage. But nevertheless, I think the very sharp contrast, the very conflict of strikes is worthy of coverage. And that's why I've studied it. And I hope you'll find value in this as well. So I'll wrap it up on that notion and thank you for your time and suggest that if you have interest in this subject or in anything else I've been doing, please feel free to contact me, MD Harmon at utk.edu. I always look forward to talking research, especially with graduate students. Thank you.